She told me to go if I was going to be possessive about her Vegas trip, so I did exactly that. That Saturday morning should have been our usual routine of coffee and weekend planning, but instead I watched Brianna pack designer clothes into her Louis Vuitton suitcase for what she called a spontaneous girls' weekend to celebrate her friend Ashley's promotion. I'd been with Brianna for 3 years, and during that time I'd learned to navigate her moods and social calendar as a network systems engineer navigates complex server architectures carefully and with increasing frequency of troubleshooting required. Our relationship had started strong when we met at a downtown Portland photography exhibit, her working as a freelance graphic designer with dreams of opening her own studio, and me stable in my tech career with a decent salary and benefits package that allowed us to build something together. Back then, she'd seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about network security and even suggesting we collaborate on a photography project documenting the city's tech infrastructure from an artistic perspective. But over the past year, I'd noticed subtle shifts in her behavior that made me feel like I was constantly walking on eggshells around topics that used to be simple conversations. She'd been staying later at her fitness classes, taking more frequent weekend trips with friends, and developing an attitude that oscillated between dismissive and demanding depending on what she wanted from me at any given moment. These changes made me question whether I was being reasonably concerned about our relationship dynamics or falling into the trap of being unreasonably controlling like the boyfriends she frequently complained about in her social circle. That particular Saturday morning, something felt distinctly different about this Vegas trip as she packed with unusual excitement, checking her phone every few minutes with small smiles that she'd quickly hide whenever she noticed me watching from the kitchen doorway. The energy was different from her usual travel preparations. There was a secretive anticipation that reminded me of how she used to act when planning surprise parties or special occasions, except this time the excitement wasn't for something we were doing together. When I casually asked who all was going on this girls' weekend, she rattled off the usual names: Ashley, Jennifer, Madison from her college sorority, but something in her tone, a slight hesitation before mentioning the guest list, made me curious enough to glance at her phone when she left it face up on the kitchen counter to grab her charger from the bedroom. What I saw made my stomach drop like discovering a critical system failure at work, a group chat titled Vegas Fun Weekend that included not just the girls she'd mentioned, but also Trevor and Kyle from her CrossFit gym, complete with messages about coordinating flights, sharing an Uber to the hotel, and even discussions about room arrangements that seemed far too detailed for a casual group trip. I set her phone down exactly where I'd found it and waited for her to return, my mind processing this information like debugging a complex problem in code, methodically, systematically, and without letting emotional interference cloud my analytical approach. When she came back into the kitchen, chattering about how much fun the weekend would be and how she needed this break from routine, I asked directly whether Trevor and Kyle were also going on the trip, keeping my voice neutral and my expression calm. Her immediate defensive response told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation would unfold and what kind of truth I was actually dealing with here. She accused me of snooping through her personal messages, of being possessive and insecure about her male friendships, and of not trusting her to maintain appropriate boundaries with people she'd known for months through the gym. Each accusation was delivered with the kind of practiced righteous anger that's specifically designed to make the other person apologize, back down, and accept blame for asking reasonable questions about transparency in a committed relationship. Instead of defending myself, explaining my concerns, or getting drawn into an argument about boundaries and honesty, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a sudden clarity that cut through 3 years of gradually increasing drama, manipulation, and the exhausting cycle of having to justify my basic expectations for mutual respect. This wasn't about trust or possessiveness. This was about someone who had already made their choice and was simply looking for permission to follow through while maintaining the moral high ground. When she finished her speech with the ultimate threat that if I was going to act possessive every time she wanted to have plans with friends, maybe I should just go and find someone who would appreciate her independence, I looked at her calmly and delivered exactly what she wasn't expecting to hear: "Have a great time." The shock on her face was immediate and unmistakable, as she'd clearly expected me to either apologize profusely or escalate the fight into the kind of dramatic scene that would justify her behavior and make me the villain in whatever story she planned to tell her friends. She stood there for a long moment, designer suitcase in one hand and phone in the other, probably waiting for me to chase after her, beg her to reconsider, or at least show some sign that this conversation was affecting me the way her previous ultimatums had worked in the past. Instead, I calmly returned to my Saturday morning coffee and opened my laptop to review some system updates that needed to be implemented the following week, while she wheeled her luggage toward the door with considerably less enthusiasm and confidence than she'd shown while packing it just minutes earlier. As the front door closed behind her with a definitive click, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful rather than anxious about what Brianna might be thinking, planning, or doing behind my back. The constant low-level stress that had become my normal state whenever she made social plans without me simply evaporated, replaced by the calm focus I used to feel when solving complex technical problems at work. I spent the rest of that Saturday morning doing things I'd forgotten I enjoyed, organizing my photography equipment, researching new camera lenses I'd been considering, and planning a solo hiking trip to Mount Hood that I'd been postponing for months because Brianna found outdoor activities boring and impractical for her carefully curated Instagram aesthetic. It was remarkable how quickly the apartment felt like mine again once the energy of constant negotiation and walking on eggshells disappeared, leaving me free to simply exist without calculating whether my actions would trigger another dramatic conversation about trust, control, or her need for independence. After Brianna left for Vegas, I found myself experiencing something I hadn't felt in months, genuine emotional clarity instead of the constant anxiety that had become my baseline whenever she made plans that excluded me. I spent the weekend doing things I'd forgotten brought me peace, like organizing my home office and researching potential freelance photography projects that might supplement my network engineering income. By Sunday evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked Instagram to see how her spontaneous girls' weekend was progressing, though I wasn't prepared for what I'd discover in her stories. The first few posts were standard Vegas fare, mimosas at brunch, poolside selfies with Ashley and the other girls, but by afternoon, her content had shifted to include Trevor and Kyle prominently in group shots at expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs I knew were well beyond her usual budget. What struck me most wasn't jealousy or betrayal, but rather a strange sense of vindication mixed with emotional detachment, as if I was watching someone else's relationship drama unfold rather than experiencing my own. As I scrolled through her posts, I remembered the time 8 months ago when she'd been struggling financially after losing a major freelance client, and I'd worked double shifts for 3 weeks to buy her the professional-grade design software and drawing tablet she needed to rebuild her portfolio. I'd even sold my vintage Canon camera equipment that I'd been collecting since college, pieces that had significant sentimental value, because seeing her succeed felt more important than my own hobbies at the time. The irony wasn't lost on me that those same creative tools were probably what she'd used to design the Instagram graphics for this Vegas trip that she was now documenting with 2 guys she'd never bothered to mention existed until I discovered them myself. Instead of feeling the crushing betrayal I might have expected, I experienced something much more powerful. The realization that her parting words about me leaving if I was going to be possessive weren't an empty threat or manipulation tactic designed to make me apologize and fall in line with her agenda. She had literally told me what she wanted me to do, and I had finally chosen to listen to what she was actually saying rather than trying to decode what I hoped she meant underneath her words. This shift in perspective felt like debugging a persistent system error that had been slowing down network performance for months. Once you identify the root cause, the solution becomes obvious even though you'd been overthinking the problem for way too long. Her social media posts throughout the weekend confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't a spontaneous trip with friends where guys happened to show up, but rather a carefully planned excursion where she'd been less than honest about the guest list and probably the entire purpose of the getaway. I found myself analyzing her behavior patterns like I would analyze network traffic logs, looking for anomalies and inconsistencies that revealed the true nature of what was happening behind the surface presentation. The Trevor and Kyle situation wasn't an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of boundary testing that had been escalating gradually over the past several months, each incident designed to see how much I'd tolerate before pushing back or demanding accountability. Every time I'd raised concerns about her increasingly frequent nights out, her defensive responses about trust and independence, or her habit of making plans without consulting me about our shared schedule. She'd managed to flip the conversation so that I ended up apologizing for being controlling rather than addressing the actual issue of mutual respect in our relationship. But this time felt different because instead of trying to win an argument or prove my point, I'd simply accepted her stated preference and responded accordingly, which apparently wasn't the script she'd been expecting me to follow. As Sunday night turned into Monday morning and her Vegas content continued to flood my feed with images of expensive dinners and VIP club access that I knew she couldn't afford on her freelance income, I realized that my emotional investment in the outcome of this trip had completely evaporated. The anxiety and jealousy I'd been carrying for months had been replaced by something much more valuable: clarity about what I actually deserved from a partnership and peace with the knowledge that I was no longer willing to accept less than that standard. Monday morning brought a text message that confirmed everything I'd been thinking about during my weekend of reflection. A photo of Brianna and her group at what looked like an expensive breakfast spot, with Trevor's arm casually draped around her shoulders in a way that spoke of familiarity rather than coincidental friendship. The caption read, "Recovery brunch with the best crew," followed by heart and airplane emojis, and I realized that seeing this image didn't trigger the emotional response it would have just a week earlier. Instead of anger or hurt, I felt something closer to relief, like finally receiving confirmation of a diagnosis you'd suspected but couldn't quite prove until the test results came back positive. This was who she'd become, or perhaps who she'd always been underneath the version of herself she'd presented during the early stages of our relationship when she still needed to secure my investment and commitment. I remembered our second anniversary dinner when she'd talked about her dreams of building a life together, saving for a house, maybe starting a family someday, and how genuine those conversations had felt at the time. But looking back with the clarity that distance and emotional detachment provide, I could see how those discussions had gradually shifted from our dreams to her expectations, and then finally to her demands that I fund and facilitate without question. The woman who had once appreciated my thoughtfulness when I surprised her with tickets to see her favorite band had somehow transformed into someone who expected expensive gestures as baseline treatment while offering increasingly less emotional connection and partnership in return. That Monday evening, as I sat in our apartment that felt more peaceful without her presence than it had in months, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to take her advice literally and completely rather than treating it as another manipulation tactic designed to make me chase after her and prove my devotion through increasingly desperate gestures. The emotional shift was so profound that I actually felt grateful to Trevor and Kyle for providing the catalyst that finally forced this situation to its logical conclusion, because without their presence on this Vegas trip, I might have continued indefinitely in the pattern of compromising my standards and accepting treatment that fell far short of what I'd provide to someone I genuinely cared about and respected. Tuesday morning, while Brianna was presumably recovering from her Vegas weekend, I called in sick to work and began the most liberating project I'd undertaken in years, systematically removing every trace of my life from our shared apartment. The process felt less like moving out and more like reclaiming components of myself that had been gradually absorbed into someone else's vision of what our life together should look like. I started with my home office setup, carefully disconnecting and packing my dual-monitor workstation, the ergonomic chair I'd bought after developing back problems from working long hours at my kitchen table, and the professional networking equipment I used for freelance consulting projects that brought in extra income Brianna had grown accustomed to spending without contributing to earning. Each item I packed represented a piece of independence I'd surrendered in the name of building something together, and reclaiming these tools felt like taking back my professional identity and personal space. The gaming setup came next: my PlayStation, the custom-built PC I'd assembled piece by piece over 2 years, and the comfortable recliner where I used to unwind after stressful days before Brianna decided that gaming was antisocial behavior that took attention away from her needs and our relationship goals. I wrapped each component carefully, remembering how she'd gradually made me feel guilty for enjoying hobbies that didn't revolve around her social calendar or entertainment preferences, turning activities that used to bring me joy into sources of conflict and negotiation. Moving to the kitchen revealed how much of our domestic life had been funded entirely by my income while she maintained the illusion of partnership. The espresso machine I'd bought after she complained about our regular coffee maker being too basic for someone with sophisticated tastes, the expensive knife set I'd purchased when she decided she wanted to learn cooking but never actually used for more than Instagram food styling, and the stand mixer that had been gathering dust since the initial excitement of baking artisanal bread wore off after one ambitious weekend. I took everything I'd purchased individually and left behind the items we'd bought together during happier times, like the decorative bowl set from our 6-month anniversary trip to Seattle and the throw pillows she'd insisted would make the living room look more sophisticated and adult. The methodical nature of this inventory process revealed the financial reality of our relationship with stark clarity. I had been funding the lifestyle of someone who contributed aesthetics and companionship while I provided housing, utilities, groceries, entertainment, and most of the actual resources required for daily life. After packing my photography equipment, books, clothes, and personal items, I called the utility companies to transfer services out of my name, a conversation that made the practical reality of separation immediate and irreversible. The customer service representative asked if I wanted to leave service connected under a different name, and I realized that Brianna had no idea these bills were entirely my responsibility because I'd been handling them automatically for so long that she'd probably forgotten they required actual payment from an actual person rather than appearing magically each month. I scheduled the disconnections for the following week, giving her enough time to contact the companies herself if she wanted to maintain electricity, internet, and cable service at the apartment she'd apparently decided to keep without me. The cable representative mentioned that there would be a significant increase in monthly costs without the bundle discounts available through my corporate account, a detail I chose not to share in the simple note I left with her spare key on the kitchen counter. Writing that note required more thought than I'd anticipated because I wanted to communicate my decision clearly without giving her ammunition for future accusations about cruelty, abandonment, or failing to communicate properly about my intentions and expectations. After several drafts, I settled on something that reflected exactly what had happened without editorial commentary. Followed your suggestion. Key and garage remote on counter. Utilities transfer out of my name Monday. Best wishes for your new chapter. Reading it back, the message sounded formal and distant, which felt appropriate given how our relationship had evolved into a series of negotiations and ultimatums rather than genuine partnership and mutual support. I loaded my belongings into a rented truck and drove them to a climate-controlled storage unit across town, a temporary solution that felt like the first step toward building whatever came next rather than holding on to what was clearly finished. My cousin Jake had offered his guest room for as long as I needed it, and driving toward his place with everything I owned packed behind me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete freedom to make decisions based on what I actually wanted rather than what would avoid conflict or meet someone else's expectations for how I should demonstrate love, commitment, and financial support. The most surprising aspect of this entire process was how little emotional turmoil accompanied what should have been one of the most stressful experiences of my adult life. Instead of grief or regret, I felt the practical satisfaction that comes with finally addressing a persistent problem that had been draining resources and energy for months without any realistic hope of improvement or resolution. As I handed over the keys to the storage unit and confirmed the security code, I realized that somewhere during those 3 years with Brianna, I'd lost sight of what normal relationship dynamics actually looked like, gradually accepting a partnership where I provided most of the tangible contributions while she provided companionship and the occasional social media post acknowledging our anniversary dates. The drive to Jake's house took me through downtown Portland, past the art gallery where Brianna and I had met and several restaurants where we'd shared meals during better times, but these landmarks triggered memories rather than heartbreak, like driving past your old elementary school and noting how much smaller it looks than you remembered. By Wednesday morning, I was settled into Jake's guest room with my laptop set up on his kitchen table, working remotely and feeling more focused and productive than I'd been in months. The constant background stress of wondering what mood Brianna would be in when I got home, whether she'd made expensive plans I'd be expected to fund, or which of her social media posts would reveal information she hadn't bothered to share with me directly had simply evaporated, leaving mental space I'd forgotten I possessed. Jake noticed the change immediately, commenting over coffee that I seemed lighter and more like the person I'd been in college before the relationship had gradually worn down my confidence and financial resources through a series of small compromises that accumulated into major lifestyle changes I'd never explicitly agreed to make. The next several days at Jake's place became a masterclass in rediscovering what peace actually felt like after months of living in a constant state of low-level anxiety about Brianna's moods, plans, and financial expectations. I'd forgotten how much mental energy had been devoted to anticipating her reactions, managing her disappointments, and navigating the complex social dynamics she created around every decision from where we ate dinner to how we spent our weekends. Without those calculations running in the background of every conversation and interaction, I found myself sleeping better, eating regular meals, and actually enjoying the work projects that had felt overwhelming when I was trying to balance professional responsibilities with relationship management. Wednesday afternoon, I made the decision to block Brianna on all social media platforms and her phone number, not out of anger or spite, but from a practical understanding that whatever communication might be coming would likely fall into predictable patterns of manipulation designed to draw me back into negotiations about our future rather than genuine reflection about what had gone wrong. As a network engineer, I understood the importance of firewalls and security protocols, and applying those same principles to my personal life felt like basic digital hygiene rather than emotional cruelty. I also requested several days of vacation time from work, explaining to my manager that I was dealing with a significant life transition and wanted to handle it properly rather than letting personal stress affect my professional performance during a critical project phase. The approval came through immediately, along with a note from my supervisor mentioning that I'd been working overtime for months without taking adequate time off, something I hadn't fully realized until he pointed out that my productivity and focus had been declining gradually as my personal situation had become more complicated and demanding. Those vacation days turned into the most restorative period I'd experienced in years, filled with activities that reminded me why I'd moved to Portland in the first place and what I'd been missing while my schedule revolved around someone else's social calendar and entertainment preferences. I spent Thursday morning walking through Powell's books, browsing photography and technology sections without worrying about whether I was taking too long or whether Brianna would be annoyed that I was indulging hobbies she found boring and antisocial. I bought 3 books about network security and a collection of Ansel Adams photographs, purchases I made purely because they interested me rather than because they served some relationship maintenance function or avoided potential conflict about my spending priorities. Friday, I drove to the Columbia River Gorge with my camera equipment, spending the entire day hiking and photographing waterfalls without checking my phone or worrying about missing calls, texts, or social media updates that might require immediate attention and emotional management. The solitude felt luxurious rather than lonely, and I realized how long it had been since I'd enjoyed my own company without feeling guilty about not being available for someone else's needs or entertainment. The photos I took that day were some of the best work I'd done in months, partly because I was shooting for my own satisfaction rather than trying to capture images that would meet someone else's aesthetic standards or generate social media engagement for their personal brand. Saturday brought apartment hunting, a process that felt surprisingly exciting rather than stressful because I was looking for space that reflected my actual preferences and budget rather than trying to find something that would satisfy someone else's vision of how we should be living and what our home should communicate about our success and status. I toured 3 different one-bedroom places, each offering the kind of quiet, organized environment where I could work effectively, pursue hobbies without judgment, and entertain friends without worrying about whether the space met someone else's standards for sophistication and social media presentation. The third apartment, located near downtown with excellent natural light and a dedicated office space, felt immediately right in a way that reminded me how decision-making used to work before every choice required negotiation, compromise, and careful consideration of how it might affect someone else's mood or plans. That evening, back at Jake's place, I realized the most remarkable thing about this entire week had been the complete absence of drama, conflict, or emotional turbulence that had become my normal baseline during the final months with Brianna. My phone stayed quiet, my schedule remained my own, and conversations with friends and family focused on topics other than relationship problems and the exhausting cycle of breakups, reconciliations, and negotiations that had dominated my social interactions for the past year. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about the future rather than anxious about managing the present, And that shift in perspective made me understand just how much energy had been diverted from building the life I actually wanted toward maintaining a relationship that had become a part-time job with increasingly demanding requirements and diminishing returns on investment. Sunday morning brought a revelation that crystallized everything I'd been processing throughout the week. As I sat in Jake's kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the news without worrying about whether my relaxed morning routine would conflict with someone else's plans or expectations, I realized that the constant tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders for months had completely disappeared. The physical relief was as noticeable as the emotional clarity, and I understood for the first time how relationship stress had been affecting not just my mental state but my actual physical well-being in ways I'd been too accustomed to notice. I spent that Sunday afternoon organizing my photography portfolio and updating my professional website, projects I'd been postponing for months because my free time had been consumed by relationship maintenance activities that never seemed to result in actual improvement or stability. Working on creative projects felt energizing rather than exhausting, and I remembered why I'd originally chosen a technical career that provided financial stability while leaving time and mental space for artistic pursuits that brought genuine satisfaction. By Sunday evening, I'd made the decision to look seriously at apartment options and begin the process of rebuilding my life according to my own preferences and priorities rather than trying to accommodate someone else's vision of what our shared future should look like. The week had taught me that the anxiety and emotional exhaustion I'd been experiencing weren't inevitable byproducts of adult relationships, but rather specific consequences of trying to maintain a partnership with someone whose needs and expectations were fundamentally incompatible with my personality, values, and approach to building sustainable long-term stability. Monday morning marked exactly 1 week since Brianna had returned from Vegas to discover our apartment transformed into a mostly empty space with disconnected utilities and a simple note explaining that I'd followed her suggestion about leaving. Jake mentioned over breakfast that he'd heard through mutual friends that she'd been calling around frantically, trying to get contact information for anyone who might know where I'd gone or how to reach me, but I'd been thorough about requesting privacy from our shared social circle during this transition period. The first attempts to contact me came through unknown phone numbers, probably borrowed from friends or acquired through apps that mask caller identity, with voicemails that cycled through predictable emotional stages designed to elicit specific responses and draw me back into negotiations about our relationship status. The initial messages were angry accusations about abandoning her financially and emotionally without warning, despite the fact that she'd literally told me to leave if I was going to be possessive about her travel plans with male friends I wasn't supposed to know about. These evolved into concerned inquiries about my mental health and whether I was having some kind of breakdown that prevented me from communicating like a rational adult about our problems, as if my decision to take her words at face value indicated psychological instability rather than simple acceptance of her stated preferences. By Wednesday, the strategy had shifted to manipulation tactics involving claims that Trevor had made unwanted advances during the Vegas trip, that she'd realized she only wanted to be with me, and that the whole weekend had been a terrible mistake she regretted more deeply than I could possibly understand. The irony of these messages wasn't lost on me. She was essentially asking me to rescue her from consequences of choices she'd made while telling me that my concerns about those same choices proved I was controlling and possessive rather than reasonably concerned about transparency and mutual respect in our relationship. Thursday brought the most desperate escalation yet. She'd contacted my sister Emma, spinning a dramatic story about me having suffered some kind of emotional breakdown and disappearing without explanation, leaving her financially devastated and unable to understand what she'd done wrong to deserve such cruel abandonment. Emma called me that evening, initially worried but quickly amused once I explained the actual sequence of events and showed her screenshots of Brianna's social media posts from Vegas featuring Trevor and Kyle prominently in expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs. My sister had never particularly liked Brianna, finding her demanding and self-centered during family gatherings, so learning about the Vegas deception and financial manipulation confirmed suspicions she'd been too polite to voice previously. The most audacious attempt came Friday when Brianna managed to get my mother's phone number and called her with tears and hysteria, claiming that I'd abandoned her without warning after 3 years together and she was worried about my mental state because this behavior was so unlike the caring, responsible man she'd fallen in love with. My mother, who had raised 3 sons and possessed finely tuned detection skills for emotional manipulation, listened politely before asking pointed questions about why Brianna hadn't tried direct communication before involving family members in their relationship problems. When Brianna couldn't provide satisfactory answers about her Vegas trip companions or her financial contributions to their shared household, my mother suggested that perhaps she should focus on becoming more self-sufficient rather than expecting family members to convince me to resume financial support for someone who'd told me to leave. These family interventions backfired spectacularly because they confirmed for my relatives what they'd suspected but hadn't felt comfortable saying, that Brianna had been taking advantage of my generous nature and financial stability while contributing relatively little to the actual partnership beyond companionship and social media presentation. My sister actually thanked me for finally setting boundaries, mentioning that she'd been worried about how much I'd changed during the relationship, becoming more anxious and less confident than the brother she'd grown up with who used to be decisive and self-assured about his choices and priorities. Throughout this entire week of attempted contact through intermediaries, I maintained complete radio silence, not because I was trying to punish Brianna or create dramatic tension, but because I understood that any response would be interpreted as an opening for negotiation and emotional manipulation designed to restore the previous dynamic where I funded her lifestyle while she provided companionship on her terms. The messaging patterns revealed something important about her mindset. She genuinely seemed to believe that I would eventually cave to pressure and return to subsidizing her life once she found the right combination of guilt, concern, and promises to change that would override my practical decision-making and restore access to the financial security I'd been providing without adequate reciprocal investment or respect. The weekend brought even more creative attempts to breach my communication boundaries, including messages sent through LinkedIn pretending to be professional networking opportunities, Facebook friend requests from accounts with fake names but her photos, and even a delivery of expensive flowers to Jake's house with a card that read, "Please call me, I know you're hurting too," as if my silence indicated emotional distress rather than deliberate choice based on clear evidence about her priorities and character. Jake found the flower delivery particularly amusing, pointing out that she was spending money she didn't have on gestures designed to manipulate me back into spending money I'd earned on lifestyle expenses she couldn't afford independently, a recursive loop of financial irresponsibility that perfectly illustrated why our relationship had become unsustainable. The most revealing incident came Sunday evening when she managed to track down my work email address and sent a message to my professional account, crossing boundaries between personal drama and career responsibilities in a way that could have created complications with my employer if I hadn't immediately forwarded it to HR as documentation of personal harassment affecting my workplace communications. Her work email message combined elements of all her previous strategies: accusations that I was being cruel and vindictive, concerns about my mental health and whether I was receiving appropriate support during this difficult time, promises that she'd learned valuable lessons about respecting boundaries and contributing equally to our partnership, and threats that mutual friends were beginning to question my character based on how I'd handled this breakup. The final paragraph revealed the real motivation behind this escalating campaign. She'd been forced to move back in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent, utilities, and basic living expenses without my financial contribution, and her family was asking uncomfortable questions about how she'd managed her finances and relationships that she was struggling to answer honestly. Reading this confession confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge during our relationship, that her attraction to me had been primarily economic rather than romantic, and her distress about our separation was focused on losing access to financial resources rather than missing my companionship, emotional support, or the life we'd been building together. This realization should have been devastating, but instead it provided the final piece of clarity I needed to understand that maintaining no contact wasn't cruel or vindictive, but rather the only response that protected both of us from continuing a dynamic that was fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable. She needed to learn how to support herself financially and emotionally without depending on someone else's resources and patience, and I needed to rebuild my confidence and financial stability without the constant drain of funding someone else's lifestyle choices while receiving criticism and ultimatums in return for my generosity and commitment. 2 weeks after moving out, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment in a converted warehouse building near downtown Portland, complete with exposed brick walls, large windows, and enough space for a proper home office that would allow me to take on more lucrative freelance consulting projects. The apartment hunting process had been surprisingly enjoyable without having to consider someone else's opinions about neighborhood safety, commute times, or whether the aesthetic would photograph well for social media posts. And I'd chosen this place specifically because it felt like a space where I could focus on rebuilding my career and personal interests without worrying about maintaining someone else's lifestyle standards. Setting up my new place became a creative project that reminded me how much I enjoyed making decisions based purely on functionality and personal preference rather than trying to accommodate someone else's vision of how our shared space should look and what it should communicate about our relationship status and financial success. I arranged my photography equipment in the corner with the best natural light, set up my gaming area without worrying about whether it looked too juvenile or antisocial, and created a kitchen workspace where I could actually cook meals I wanted to eat rather than expensive ingredients chosen for Instagram potential. The mental space that had been occupied by constant relationship maintenance and financial coordination became available for other priorities, and I decided to try something I'd been avoiding for years due to Brianna's opinions about online dating being desperate and beneath people who should be meeting potential partners through sophisticated social circles and professional networking events. Creating dating profiles felt like an interesting technical challenge, selecting photos that represented my actual interests and personality rather than trying to project an image designed to attract someone whose attention would require constant expensive maintenance and lifestyle performance. I matched with several women during my first week on the apps, but Celia stood out immediately because her profile mentioned environmental consulting work, weekend hiking trips, and a love for independent films and bookstores rather than expensive restaurants, luxury travel, and designer fashion brands that suggested costly entertainment expectations. Our initial conversations flowed naturally around topics like sustainable technology, photography techniques, and Portland's independent movie theaters, subjects that hadn't come up in relationship discussions for months because Brianna found them boring compared to social media trends, celebrity gossip, and planning expensive weekend activities that showcased our relationship for her online audience. When I suggested meeting for dinner at a small wine bar known for its local food and intimate atmosphere, Celia's enthusiasm about the choice confirmed that she appreciated thoughtful planning over expensive spectacle, a refreshing change from having to research the most exclusive and photogenic restaurants in Portland to avoid disappointment and accusations about not putting enough effort into date planning. Our first date felt remarkably relaxed and genuinely enjoyable, marked by easy conversation about work projects, shared interests in documentary photography, and travel experiences that focused on cultural immersion rather than luxury accommodations and social media content creation. She asked thoughtful questions about my network engineering work and seemed genuinely interested in the technical challenges involved in maintaining secure systems for financial services companies. A level of professional curiosity I'd forgotten was possible after years of relationship conversations that treated my career as a resource generator rather than an intellectually engaging pursuit that contributed meaningfully to society. During dinner, my phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from unknown numbers that I recognized as part of Brianna's ongoing campaign to re-establish contact, but instead of feeling anxious or apologetic about the interruption, I simply turned the device face down and continued focusing on Celia's story about a recent consulting project involving wetland restoration that had required creative collaboration between environmental scientists and local community groups. The contrast between my peaceful new reality and the chaos that Brianna was apparently experiencing became stark as the evening progressed, and I realized that her frantic attempts to contact me were actually confirming the wisdom of my decision to prioritize emotional stability and genuine compatibility over dramatic intensity and expensive lifestyle maintenance. Celia mentioned that she'd been single for 6 months after ending a relationship with someone who'd been more interested in her earning potential than her personality, a parallel experience that created immediate understanding about the difference between partnerships based on mutual respect and those focused primarily on economic advantage or social status enhancement. As we walked to our cars after dinner, discussing plans to visit a photography exhibition the following weekend, my phone lit up with 3 more missed calls, but the interruption felt irrelevant to the genuine connection I just experienced with someone who appreciated simple pleasures and intellectual conversation over constant entertainment and financial demonstrations of commitment. The realization that dating could actually be enjoyable rather than stressful, based on shared interests and compatible values rather than my ability to fund increasingly expensive lifestyle expectations, made me understand how much energy I'd been wasting on someone whose primary attraction to me had been economic rather than personal, and how much better life could be with someone who chose to be with me for reasons that actually related to who I was rather than what I could provide. The following week brought news through mutual friends that Brianna had discovered my presence on dating apps and was apparently devastated to learn that I was already meeting other people rather than spending this time reflecting on our relationship and working toward reconciliation like she'd expected. This information reached me through Jake, who'd heard from someone at his gym that Brianna had been asking around about my activities and emotional state, clearly operating under the assumption that my silence indicated heartbreak and eventual surrender rather than deliberate choice and genuine contentment with the direction my life was taking. The fact that she was monitoring my social activities while living back with her parents and struggling to manage basic expenses without my financial contribution revealed how little she understood about my actual motivations for ending our relationship, and how much she'd underestimated my capacity for building a satisfying life that didn't revolve around her needs and dramatic emotional cycles. Jake mentioned that according to his source, Brianna had been telling people that my quick transition to dating other women proved I'd never really loved her and had probably been planning this breakup for months while pretending everything was normal, a narrative that conveniently ignored her own Vegas trip with Trevor and Kyle and the ultimatum that had precipitated my departure. This revisionist interpretation of our relationships and confirmed what I'd suspected about her tendency to reframe situations in ways that cast her as the victim of other people's poor choices rather than someone who had actively contributed to the dysfunction and instability that made our partnership ultimately untenable. The irony of her distress about my dating activities wasn't lost on me, considering that she'd been the one pushing boundaries with male friends and creating situations designed to test my tolerance for behavior that fell outside normal relationship expectations, but somehow my decision to move forward with other people represented a betrayal that she hadn't anticipated or authorized. This double standard revealed the fundamental immaturity in her approach to relationships, where she expected freedom to explore other options while maintaining exclusive access to my emotional and financial resources until she decided what arrangement would best serve her interests and lifestyle goals. 3 weeks after signing the lease on my new apartment, Celia and I had developed a comfortable routine of weekend activities that reminded me what healthy relationship dynamics actually looked like when both people contributed equally to planning, expenses, and emotional investment rather than one person funding the lifestyle choices of someone who provided companionship in exchange for financial security. That Saturday morning, we decided to try the popular outdoor cafe near Pioneer Courthouse Square for brunch before visiting a photography exhibition at the Portland Art Museum, a simple plan that felt refreshing in its lack of drama, hidden agendas, or expensive expectations designed to test my commitment through financial demonstration. We were halfway through our meal, discussing the technical aspects of black and white photography and laughing about Celia's attempts to master her new camera settings, when Brianna appeared at our table like a storm system that had been tracking our location and waiting for the perfect moment to cause maximum disruption and emotional chaos. She looked visibly distressed, wearing clothes that suggested she'd dressed hastily and driven directly from her parents' house without considering how this public confrontation might appear to other diners or what it revealed about her current mental state and decision-making capacity. Her immediate demand to speak with me privately, delivered with the kind of desperate urgency that suggested she believed this conversation could somehow reverse 3 weeks of deliberate no contact and restore access to the relationship dynamic she'd been taking for granted until I'd actually followed through on her ultimatum about leaving. I calmly explained that anything she needed to communicate could be said in front of Celia, partly because I had nothing to hide about our breakup or the reasons behind my decision to move forward with other relationships, and partly because public accountability tends to prevent the kind of emotional manipulation and dramatic scene-making that thrives in private conversations where there are no witnesses to keep behavior within reasonable boundaries. Brianna's breakdown began immediately, starting with tears and progressing to increasingly frantic explanations about how she'd been forced to move back with her parents because she couldn't afford basic living expenses without my financial contribution. A confession that confirmed everything I'd suspected about the primarily economic nature of our relationship but hadn't wanted to acknowledge while I was still emotionally invested in making things work. She admitted that her entire Vegas ultimatum had been designed as a test to make me more attentive and committed rather than an actual invitation for me to leave, revealing the manipulative mindset that had been operating behind what I'd interpreted as honest communication about her needs and expectations for our partnership. The most telling moment came when she explained through tears that she'd expected me to fight for our relationship instead of simply accepting her stated preference, as if healthy partnerships should be based on my ability to decode hidden meanings and respond to indirect communication rather than trusting that she meant what she said when she told me to go if I was going to be possessive about her undisclosed travel companions. This revelation made me understand that our fundamental problem hadn't been about trust or boundaries, but about her expectation that I would engage in psychological games where my love was demonstrated through persistence in the face of rejection rather than respect for her autonomy and stated decisions about what kind of relationship dynamic she preferred. When she finished her emotional appeal with desperate promises about how much she'd learned and how different things would be if I gave her another chance, I responded with the same calm clarity that had guided my decision-making throughout this entire process, explaining that I'd loved the person she'd pretended to be during the early stages of our relationship, but the real her had told me to leave, and I'd chosen to listen to the real her rather than hoping the pretend version would eventually return. Celia sat quietly throughout this entire exchange, neither interfering nor appearing uncomfortable with the situation, which impressed me as evidence of her emotional maturity and confidence in our developing relationship rather than the kind of territorial insecurity that might have turned this difficult moment into an even more complicated drama involving multiple people's feelings and competing claims on my attention. After Brianna left our table, visibly defeated and probably beginning to understand that her manipulation strategies were no longer effective now that I'd experienced what genuine partnership could feel like with someone who contributed equally to building something together rather than expecting me to fund her lifestyle while she provided companionship and occasional affection, Celia and I continued our brunch conversation as if nothing particularly significant had happened. Her only comment about the interruption was a thoughtful observation that Brianna seemed more upset about losing financial security than losing me personally, which demonstrated the kind of psychological insight and emotional intelligence that made me appreciate how much better my life had become since I'd stopped trying to maintain a relationship with someone whose priorities and values were fundamentally incompatible with mine. We spent the rest of that afternoon at the photography exhibition, discussing composition techniques and planning our own collaborative project documenting Portland's urban gardens, activities that felt meaningful and enriching rather than expensive and performative, confirmation that I'd made the right choice in prioritizing genuine compatibility over dramatic intensity and lifestyle maintenance that required constant financial investment with diminishing emotional returns. Walking through the gallery with Celia, I realized that this single afternoon contained more intellectual stimulation and genuine connection than most entire months of my previous relationship had provided, and the contrast made me understand how much of my energy and emotional capacity had been consumed by managing someone else's moods and expectations rather than building something mutually satisfying and sustainable. The photography exhibition featured works by local artists who'd found beauty in everyday urban scenes, a perspective that resonated with both of us as people who appreciated finding meaning in simple moments rather than requiring constant entertainment and expensive experiences to feel fulfilled and connected to our surroundings. As we discussed the technical aspects of various pieces and shared ideas about angles and lighting that might work for our own project, I felt the kind of creative excitement and intellectual partnership that I'd forgotten was possible when both people in a relationship actually enjoyed each other's company and shared similar approaches to finding satisfaction and meaning in daily life.